Let's talk a little bit about the shared responsibility model. Now, this is nothing new. This is something that vendors have had in place for a long time, and it represents a sort of agreement between a provider and a customer. And in the context of AWS, it's going to help us understand who takes responsibility for the ownership of different parts of the infrastructure, the services, the features and resources that are launched into the AWS ecosystem. And so first, let's talk a little bit about the AWS side of it. Now, Amazon Web Services are going to be responsible for the security of the cloud itself. So what does this mean? This is going to be the underlying infrastructure from data centers and physical locations through the individual bits and pieces of hardware that make up those data centers, servers, storage, network hardware, and so forth. They're going to be responsible for the physical protection of those data centers and making sure that access is only granted when it is absolutely required. AWS is going to be responsible for all of the Service API endpoints and securing those. And they're responsible for the assurance that when you issue a command or request a task be performed through those Service API endpoints, that it is executed faithfully by the service. The customer is not left out. The customer also has a share of this responsibility. And so from the customer perspective, you, me, us, we are responsible for the security in the cloud. And there's a difference between security of the cloud and security in the cloud. The customer is going to be responsible for the security of the individual resources that they provision within their various AWS accounts. And this includes a lot of different layers depending on the type of service that you're using. If you are using an infrastructure service like a VPC network or a virtual machine in EC2, you as the customer are going to have a higher degree of responsibility over securing that resource than if you use something that is closer to a SaaS offering, software as a service, like an S3 bucket or a DynamoDB table. Now, one thing to be clear is that the customer always owns their data, and that the data is always private, regardless of the service, unless the customer explicitly shares it publicly. Now, the next thing we need to talk about within the shared responsibility model is ownership of IT controls. And so these are going to be tasks that need to be regularly performed, audited, and assured that they are being performed. And so this is going to have a bit of a spectrum as far as the responsibility as well. And so we start off here on the left with AWS. And AWS is going to be responsible for certain actions like physically securing the facilities that AWS data centers are operating in. They're responsible for everything from air conditioning to redundant power and so forth. All of that underlying infrastructure that makes AWS work. There's a middle ground where both AWS and the customer share some of these controls. And here's an excellent example. AWS deploys actual servers into the data centers. There is an AWS-owned control to manage that hardware. There is a shared control where AWS is responsible for the patch management of the hypervisor that runs on that hardware. And then the customer is going to share some of that by being responsible for the patch management of the virtual machines that actually run on top of that hypervisor. And so these shared controls are going to apply to both the provider and the customer, but in different contexts. And finally, we have the customer controls. And this is where the customer gets to make explicit choices about where and how to deploy their workloads, where AWS makes these choices available, but it is up to the customer to actually choose them based on their own requirements, like which regions are going to be used, or which services or features are going to be opted into. Now, this final diagram shows a little bit more of the big picture around the specific tasks that are split up between the customer and AWS. And you can see here we have listed customer at the top, where you own your data. You own the OS, network, and firewall configuration. You're responsible for configuration of encryption of data, and so forth. And then on the bottom, we've got AWS, responsible for the security of the cloud itself. And we have the hardware here, different regions, availability zones, service API endpoints, as well as the underlying structure that makes up the different services for compute, network, storage, and database.